Joanna Macy, the great environmental activist and systems ecologist, said that when faced with planetary crisis, there are three stories we can tell ourselves. Business as usual, in which we tell ourselves that some degree of damage is necessary for human progress. The great unraveling, in which we tell ourselves that mass ecosystem destruction is inevitable. And the great turning, in which we tell ourselves that evolving the way we live is the only way forward, and that we're at the beginning of one of the great projects in human history. On this podcast, we talk to people who are writing that third story, with their own work and their own lives. Mission-driven leaders who are dedicated to social and environmental impact at this critical moment for our species. Welcome to The Turning Point. This episode is a companion to our recent episode with Nicole Rahm of Good Power, where we talked about the importance of public opinion and policy. Today, with Deb McNamara of Climate Voice, we're addressing a real elephant in the climate crisis room, corporate influence.
Yeah. And as the person who, how should we say, entertains more fringe narratives in this business partnership, I feel like this was a pretty therapeutic episode for me. It's a topic that I think is really hard to think about, and it's generally one that I prefer not to, but it's hard to avoid, right? And I think I'm probably not alone in that either. But it was great to have someone on who could really kind of demystify the influence, the power of corporate influence, and then the impact that actually has on daily lives and climate policy.
Yeah, even for someone like me who is a little more attuned to the political winds, I still find myself getting pretty frustrated and wondering what we can actually do about the power of corporate lobbyists and their, recorded ability to delay and block and obfuscate what we all know is needed policy progress.
Yeah. So if there are listeners out there like me who sometimes waffle between like rage and avoidance, this episode was really useful and provided some constructive dialogue and direction in terms of what citizens, especially concerned citizens like us, can actually do about it to have a positive influence.
Yeah. So maybe this is therapy for everybody. So in that case, Step 1, listen to this episode with Deb McNamara of Climate Voice and take detailed notes. Step 2, follow up with her and Climate Voice.
Let's dive in.
Hey, Deb McNamara, welcome to The Turning Point.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, really glad to have you here today. So I think the influence of the private sector on public policy is something that everybody assumes is happening, but I don't think a lot of people really understand how it works. So I'm wondering if you can start by helping us understand how that influence actually works in practice.
Sure. I'd love to do that. So as you all mentioned, I'm Deb. I work with Climate Voice, and our focus is on working with the private sector to engage employees and sustainability professionals and business leaders to advocate for climate policy and to help their companies be working for climate-related policies and not opposing them, which leads me to what I'm about to say in terms of how the private sector is interfacing with how policy is shaped. So unfortunately, the private sector is playing an outsized role in how our policies are shaped in this country. And part of that is because companies have so much power and influence. They have the financial means to be weighing in heavily in their lobbying practices. So part of how it plays out is that companies are part of trade associations, which are then lobbying heavily for and against different policies. And unfortunately, when it comes to climate-related policies or policies that impact our public health and pollution standards, for example, the decisions that are being made are often opposing these policies that would protect public health or work for the climate. So a lot of this is happening behind the scenes. So there's some corporate engagement that's visible, but a lot of it is behind the scenes. So, for example, companies are often making political contributions, some of which you hear about and are trackable and transparent. Some of them are not. There is just direct lobbying where a company will, in a transparent way, lobby for or against something, and that's easier to trace. But a lot of times the lobbying goes through these different entities, including trade associations, which are then heavily influencing the policy outcome. And I guess I'd love to give an example of one large player in this space, and it's the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. So most people have heard of at least their local chambers, but there's also a massively powerful trade association called the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. one of, if not the largest, one of the largest trade groups in the world. So it has enormous influence. It's representing some 3 million businesses. And unfortunately, that trade group, for example, is almost always lobbying in the same direction as the oil and gas industry. And maybe for listeners, this is not that surprising, but I think it's an important element that we should all understand that's happening behind the scenes. So, in the US, how it's showing up is that we have companies that have all kinds of pro-climate goals and values and sustainability commitments and emissions reductions commitments and a lot of stated goals and values related to climate change. However, they're then joining these groups, these trade associations that are actively lobbying against any of the policies that would help the companies meet their own goals. And so that's the dynamic that we're working to address at Climate Voice. And for example, I mentioned the role of the oil and gas industry. These trade groups are lobbying in the same direction as, for example, the American Gas Association or the American Petroleum Institute. Those lobbying agendas are setting the agenda for the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, for example. Even though the Chamber of Commerce is representing millions of businesses that aren't always benefiting from the same things that benefit the oil and gas industry. But the whole system is stacked to favor the oil and gas industry. And the oil and gas industry pours an enormous amount of lobbying capital, and that meaning money, influence, connections, into blocking anything and everything that would actually move us forward when it comes to, for example, enabling stronger clean energy policies in this country. And maybe I'll stop there. I imagine you probably have a few follow-up questions, but hopefully that paints a little bit of the bigger picture at play that I think a lot of us don't know about. And to be quite frank, a lot of employees in companies who are members of these trade associations also don't realize that this is happening too, that their company is de facto lobbying against climate-related policies just by being members of these groups.
Okay, so before I ask all of my follow-up questions, I want to restate the problem and make sure I'm getting it right. The ways in which companies are influencing, number one is they make donations to campaigns, which I assume has some weight in terms of how individual members of Congress vote. Right? Potentially. And some of those donations are transparent, some of them are not. The second thing you're telling us is that there are third-party organizations, for example, the Chamber of Commerce, to which a lot of these companies donate a lot of their money, and then the third-party organizations are doing a lot of the work of lobbying. And lobbying is acting on policy, right? Either reshaping policy that is moving forward or blocking policies from moving forward. So this is after all of us have voted and after campaigns have happened. Am I capturing like the main channels of influence well?
Yeah. Yes.
Okay, great. So I have several follow-up questions after that. But the first is, so if my company donates to the Chamber of Commerce, do I then still have a lot of influence over what the Chamber of Commerce is doing with my money and how it's lobbying? Or are there a small number of players who are doing that donating who have, like you said, outsized influence on how the Chamber of Commerce is spending its money?
Yes. Well, I would say yes. It's looking like the oil and gas companies are having outsized influence on how the chamber is ending up lobbying. However, that said, any company that is a member of a trade group, such as the Chamber of Commerce, does have influence and should be using that influence. And that's part of what we're working on at Climate Voice. And in fact, there is a subset of companies who are members of the chamber who created a climate solutions working group to address this problem. However, it has thus far failed to course correct the lobbying track record of the Chamber of Commerce when it comes to climate-related policies. However, that doesn't mean it's still not possible. I think that's the challenge ahead of us, is how can companies who in and of themselves wield massive influence, there are plenty of other sectors in the American economy that wield influence. The question is, how can those companies join together and become more influential in their lobbying power? And it remains to be seen how we're able to do that.
Yeah. So Deb, if we could drop down, well, maybe from that point, go up one rung on the ladder. I would like to ask just another question about like the playing field itself. In this country, the term companies means so much, right? Like individual solopreneurs all the way up to Fortune 100. So I think you said the U.S. Chamber of Commerce has 3 million participants in it, but there's a subset that has an outsized influence Could you give us a better understanding of the landscape of how big are these companies that are actually having that outsized influence? And like, is there any line of demarcations anywhere to help us just understand the playing field?
Yeah, well, I would say a lot of the companies are enormous. And so, for example, big tech companies is a great example, that's a great example. So, tech companies are members of these trade groups, such as the US Chamber of Commerce and or the Business Roundtable, to name another one. And so these are enormously influential companies in America and have a seat at the table and an influential seat at the table at these trade groups, and so certainly can be steering the conversation if they were to want to. The automotive industry, the auto industry is another example. And of course, we shouldn't be surprised that, of course, they're weighing in heavily when it comes into policies pertaining to electric vehicles, for example. So depending on the issue, different sectors will speak up, more vocally than others. There are plenty of smaller companies too, and I don't want to diminish the role that smaller companies can be playing right now too. For example, there's another trade group or trade industry group called the American Sustainable Business Network. And I like to uplift that as a positive example of businesses coming together with a common goal to influence policy outcomes in ways that are more in alignment with community well-being, public health, the environment, pollution standards, and so on. So there are examples where smaller companies can band together and use their influence to be lobbying for policy change. And I like to mention American Sustainable Business Network as a good example of that. And I wish that larger companies who are members of many trade groups, but I wish that they would band together and form new coalitions where they could be leaders in this space and be advocating for policy change that's more on the side of people and the environment.
So this may or may not be an answerable question, but let's just say, for instance, I'm Google, or I am the person who's responsible for like this side of Google's business. And in my mind, I would like to be on the side of positive environmental impact. And maybe even I believe that most of my executive team and my business believes that. And I say those things publicly, but I'm donating this money to the Chamber of Commerce. And I know for a fact the Chamber of Commerce is being led largely by other interests, and they're doing something else with my money. Do I just not care because the Chamber of Commerce does other things that I care about that benefit me, and this is just not the hill I'm going to die on? Or is it more like, well, I'm saying this thing out of one side of my mouth and I'm doing this other thing because I actually do believe it is in my interest? Like, is it duplicitous behavior, or is it more just a systemic flaw? And it's like, well, I'm not going to die on that hill, whatever. I'm not going to pull out of the Chamber of Commerce just because I dislike this one policy.
Yes, I think it's a bit of both. And I do want to mention that companies have left the chamber over climate policy, and Apple is a well-cited example. They left a long time ago in 2009. They're doing just fine not being members of the chamber. They did leave over this issue back when it was more fashionable, perhaps, to be more outwardly outspoken about caring about climate change. But I think there are a couple things going on. One, I think there is this gap between sustainability teams and government affairs teams and how the systems are all working together. But I think there is growing awareness of the problem now. So now it is a question of, okay, what is our actual intent? It's not as hidden as it might have been a few years ago when people weren't paying closer attention. I think there has been movement in the corporate space to be more aware of these issues. A lot of attention has been raised around this issue, and there's been more of a focus on the need for transparency and disclosure and lobbying alignment. So there is some progress there. I think a lot of it is a systemic challenge where we are all participating in these systems that are unfortunately heading us in what I think is the absolute wrong direction when it comes to true sustainability, meaning how humans and businesses are able to flourish and thrive in relationship with our environment. I think that all of us are participating in these systems. We need to recreate the systems to be more in favor of our own personal self-interest, actually. Company self-interest and human being, like our own personal and family self-interest. So I think that's the work that we need to do.
Yeah. And we're only 15 minutes, I think, into this. And I'm already so grateful that you're here shedding light on this topic, because I almost feel like it's one of those topics that is so maddening and so difficult to wrap one's head around, because it's all happening in the shadows, right? None of us really know how how corporate giants are influencing policy, and we don't feel like we have any access, A, to what's happening behind closed doors, and B, even if we did, to do anything about it. And it's like the elephant in the room in the sustainability movement to me. And so I really appreciate that you're here shedding light on it. And so as a way to shed more light on it, I was wondering if there's any way you could give us an example of a big event that's happened in this space recently, like a big policy where this sort of corporate influence has really been influential in how things actually turned out for us as a country.
Yeah, absolutely. I can give you a couple of examples. So in recent years, some big policy issues that have come up where these trade associations and thus their corporate members have been blocking progress. Some examples are the EPA's methane standards. These trade associations moved to block those. EPA power plant rules, the Security and Exchange Commission's climate disclosure rules. California also had its own version of climate disclosure rules. And for those who might not be in the weeds of what that all means, those are the rules that would require companies to be reporting on their emissions. So helping us track how our emissions and reporting on them. The soot standards is another issue. So these are all policy issues that have come and gone in recent years, and the trade associations have been against all of these things. And all of these things translate into reducing pollution, for example. So for listeners who are like, what does this all have to do with me? It's not, truck standards or power plant standards have to do with our communities and the pollution that we're exposed to as a start. And then, of course, as it connects with climate change, it's all about the emissions. And methane is a really important greenhouse gas that traps heat 80 times more than other greenhouse gases. So to have these powerful entities blocking progress on all of these things is devastating for our collective work on climate. And I'll mention one other example that just happened, and this is a little bit in the weeds, so forgive me, but maybe folks heard about the endangerment finding.
Yes.
So this was a big fight last year where we were asking companies and trade associations to stand up for the endangerment finding and why this is important. So this is the Environmental Protection Agency's endangerment finding. It basically says that carbon pollution negatively impacts human health, like public health and the environment. We now are in the process of losing this endangerment finding. That's one of the first, one of the key moves under this new administration this last year was to repeal that finding, which basically says that carbon pollution does not adversely impact us or the environment. And unfortunately, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, for example, went along with that. So I think this is what I want everyone to understand is that the drive towards deregulation is so much greater than so many other societal needs. And that is already having incredible negative impacts on so many of us around the country, and it will only get worse. And so until we can get more engagement to stand up for rules like this, we're just going to continue heading in the wrong direction in this space.
And so, Deb, again, if I could just ask, if I could double click on this, you've mentioned a lot about how we're advocating against healthy environmental policies, or rather, these stakeholders are. And this might be a bit of a black box question, but why is that? Is it profit motivated? Are they truly just, bad people? I'm sure there's so many conflicting narratives out there. And I'm sure as a listener, just myself thinking, I don't understand why this is such a challenge, right? So what are the incentives here to be advocating against some of these regulations?
It's something that I actually truly don't understand the deeper I get into this is because honestly, I'm working directly with sustainability professionals and employees in these very companies that we're talking about who are continuing to make these decisions that, are not heading us in the right direction by my estimation. However, everybody does care about it and wants to change it. So what is it? I would like to say that I do think it is the outsized influence of the fossil fuel industry and that is continuing to hamstring us on so many levels. And unfortunately, corporate America just went along with, for example, killing clean energy in this country. That's another example. Like last year, we were doing everything we could to fight against the so-called One Big Beautiful Bill, which basically destroyed clean energy in America, or tried to. It's not succeeding, just for the record, but tried to. But it's making clean energy more expensive and harder to permit and putting up all kinds of roadblocks. So here we are with, gas prices skyrocketing at a time when we've just, the systems, the policies have done everything they can to disable the acceleration of clean energy in this country, which would help us to be so much more resilient. You save money while we're at it. I mean, most people seem to understand that, especially in the business community. So I am perplexed, and I think anyone listening should also be perplexed, and we should be asking this question over and over again. Like, what are we going along with here, and why? Especially now that the arguments aren't just cleaner air or a livable climate. It's like, let's save money while we're at it too.
Yep. And thanks, Ian, for asking the painful and obvious question. And I think it's a critical one. And I think I can tie some of these loose ends together. This is not an authoritative explanation, but as we all know, well, maybe not as we all know, our political system is actually designed to favor motivated obstruction by narrow groups of people. It just is. It is a status quo motivated system. It's designed to resist change, mostly so that we don't have kings and monarchs, but it doesn't work very well for public interest policy. So clean air, livable climate, these are broad public goods, right? The people who are motivated to deregulate are very small, narrowly interested groups like fossil fuel companies whose bottom lines are significantly affected by this sort of regulation. And it's easier to stop a policy than to make a policy. So if you're trying to stop protection of public goods, it's actually very easy for a highly motivated and well-funded minority to do that. And that's what's been happening. That's just the way our system is designed. And the reason we have agencies like the EPA is that we recognize that problem, and we tried to create these agencies whose job was to act independently in the public interest in a research-based, evidence-based way to create things like the endangerment finding, which created the foundation for saying public health matters, and we have the authority to basically administrate on behalf of public health and create regulation. That's the reason we have these public agencies. What's happening now is private interest has succeeded at chipping away at the power of those public agencies to do that stuff. And that's what happened with the endangerment finding. They're actually trying to get rid of the whole underpinning rationale for the EPA existing. That's an aside. But what I think Climate Voice is doing...
And people should know about this. I'm so glad you're talking about it here, because I think this is all happening in the back. It's the noise in the background of all the other noise, and it's really important. So thank you for talking about it.
Yeah, this is a lot more than I typically rant when I'm hosting an interview, but I think this is important context. And so this is what brings me back to Climate Voice. What you appear to be doing to me is figuring out a way for the people to start using their voice, using the instrumentation of the current system. And so now I think we've reached like the trough of this interview, like the most depressing part. Now I'm hoping you can tell us what you're doing with Climate Voice and how employees, groups of students, whatever, can gather their influence and do something positive using the current system.
Yes, absolutely. So yes, thank you for bringing us in this direction. So what is exciting about all of this is that our systems, even though they are so fixed and entrenched, they are inherently changeable, and they can be fluid. And the systems are only as strong as those of us who are willing to uphold them, right? So are excited to be working with people on the inside of companies who are members of these trade associations that are problematic for the reasons that I've described, and who are working to pressure their leaders from the inside to change. So as with any transformation, either starting with an individual, for example, like the change has to happen from the inside, right? So this is what we're working towards and for at Climate Voice. So the good news is that there are tens of thousands of employees inside companies who care about these issues and who want to do something about it. They want to believe that their companies are like being authentic when they say that they have sustainability values, for example, and they want to help their company to actually embody that. So the good news is that there is always the chance for us to change. And when we, and same with large organizations and companies too. So within companies, there are sustainability connected communities, green teams, even small working groups that are dedicated to policy advocacy. And that is what we're working to leverage right now. So with every issue that I've raised so far in our conversation, we've had employees and sustainability professionals on the inside of their companies raising the issue, asking questions, having meetings, getting petitions going, asking questions at town halls, sending emails, making sure that there is at least the understanding of the conflicts at play and being clear about what the asks are, like what we want you as our business leader to do in this moment. So that is all happening and continues to happen as we speak. And so that's one thing we're doing. So helping employees in companies have the information they need to build the case for change. Another thing that we're doing is we're organizing employees across companies. And that's actually something new that we just started to do at the beginning of last year. This was employees themselves coming to us saying, we're so upset about what's happening, like the direction that we're going in. And what can we do about it? So now employees are meeting regularly across companies, when I'm saying these are large U.S.-based companies, and swapping stories, sharing resources, and for example, having some success with, and this is not necessarily policy related, but getting their companies to offer fossil-free 401k options, for example, or more socially responsible 401k options. So I mention this just as an example because there are so many things we have to change systemically, and policy is top of my list. But then there's also this issue of the systems are powerful because we are all investing in them too. And I'm talking specifically about fossil fuels. Our money is invested in these systems too. So what else can we be doing to help shape the system? So the good news is there are a lot of leverage points and a lot of people working on this. I think anyone listening, I invite you all to be thinking about who are your networks? Like where do you have influence? Like who can you be pressing for change, whether it's your school or your faith community or your school district, whoever it is. So there's always a leverage point. So I just invite us to be thinking about that.
Excellent. Yes. And that's good to hear that there are leverage points where we can do work. So I'm wondering if you could, again, give us some examples of where some of the work that Climate Voice is doing is starting to influence policy in a positive way. So you could give us maybe an example of how those leverage points are working in a good direction.
Yeah, well, I'll give you back to the endangerment finding. I will say that one of the things we were doing is mobilizing our networks to get their companies to be defending the endangerment finding and to have their trade groups weigh in too. And actually, the Business Roundtable, they were not like gung-ho, let's repeal it. They did express concerns. It hasn't thus far led to the outcome that we need yet, but that's an example of there were members that were raising their concerns, and that made a difference. And so the Business Roundtable did not jump on board the way the chamber did in terms of being full on in support of the repeal of the endangerment finding. So that's one example, and that just happened. I also know that even within American Petroleum Institute, there was some friction where member companies of API were like, wait a minute, should we really be repealing this? And that might be somewhat surprising. But again, that was forced discourse by members saying, wait, let's take a pause here. Is this really what we should be doing? So that's just one recent example of sort of the behind the scenes pressure and the rub that is happening that it's will in the end help us to be choosing differently next time. Another example is I like to give this example of Microsoft employees. So Microsoft has a sustainability connected community with about 10,000 members. It might be more now. And those employees were very concerned about Microsoft's membership with the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and asked for change, asked a lot of questions, had a lot of meetings internally with decision makers. And Microsoft published an audit showing their trade association relationships and looking at where there's alignment or misalignment. And I give that as another example. I think that it was in response to employees saying, wait a minute, we say this, why are we doing this? So that's a first step. And lots of other companies have been doing that too. So auditing trade association relationships has become much more common. And now there's more of a move to, okay, and now what? Now we need to align. So all of that is happening.
So that sounds like some good long game material.
Yeah.
You also have some stories on your website about influencing local and state level policy. And Nicole Rahm from Good Power also spoke a lot about the importance of local and state level policy. So I'm wondering if you could keep elaborating on that for us.
Yeah, Yeah. And I would say, and this ties in with, what any of us can be doing. I know we're talking a lot about companies and using leverage in your workplace or finding your influence and leverage points in your workplace. But wherever you are, you can be advocating for state level climate policies. And there are so many right now. So yes, at Climate Voice, we have been very focused on a lot of these federal regulations and policy issues that we've already talked about. But this year, we've been more focused on state level opportunities. And one of the most exciting is plug-in solar legislation. So the good news for listeners is that, and again, this is part of why I think all of the efforts at the federal level to kill clean energy is thankfully not succeeding. Since last year, there's been this upswelling of interest in what's called plug-in solar, or balcony solar is what it's called in Europe. But there are these small solar panels that can be set up really anywhere, even like on a small patio or just on the side of a house, and can help to offset some of your energy use that where you'd otherwise be using fossil fuels. So plug-in solar bills have passed in Utah and Maine and Virginia, and there are, I think it's over 30 pieces of active legislation underway right now across the country. And this is not, a red state, blue state issue. This is a bipartisan opportunity where people are seeing, wow, this could really help everyday Americans offset energy costs. And it's a way to make clean energy more accessible and affordable for everyone. So I'm really excited about that. Climate Voice has just published a little mini policy brief on plug-in solar. That's a great place where if you're in one of the 30 states where there's legislation, you can weigh in and say, I want this. Reach out to your legislators and let them know. And if it hasn't come to your state yet, let them know. And I would just quickly say you could go to Bright Saver is a great organization that's working on that. So listeners can go to Bright Saver. I think it's Bright Saver, and learn more about where the legislation's happening and how to get involved.
Yeah. And I would like to pause here for a moment. And as someone who can tend to feel fatalistic around, federal policy and where things are going, I think the articulation of the conversation that we're having, part of what I'm hearing you say is that being able to create a space for constructive conversation to happen is really essential in order to be able to take steps in any positive direction. And so part of it is just organizing. And I think if we could translate that to the people who do feel, a little fatalistic or pessimistic about where things are going, there's still a lot of room to make improvement, even if things at the federal level are going in one particular direction. But in order to make those improvements, it requires being involved. And I think this is something that I tend to naturally forget, because it's easy to just look at the big picture and then paint with a broad brush about how negative things can be. But if you can find these other pockets and other spaces where movement is happening, it can, bring some life back into the system. So Deb, I'm wondering, could you share a little bit about, are there any key, policy fights where you feel like Climate Voice is particularly impactful or trying to have an impact right now? Because you've spent a lot of time talking about leverage points. So what's the focus right now aside from plug-in solar?
Yeah. So I'd say plug-in solar is a big one right now. And then the other area where we've been focused is on AI and data center policies. And we're actually working with a lot of employees in big tech companies who are on the inside, even some of them working on AI, but also wanting to figure out what should the environmental guardrails be. And what we're doing is helping to give examples of, okay, here are a couple of types of policies that you should be trying, getting your company to support. So for example, here in Colorado, there's a bill that would incentivize having new data centers be powered by clean energy. So I'd say this is a really big issue right now, is how can we offset the enormous increase in fossil fuel emissions that is coming and already underway with the expansion of AI and data centers. What can we do to have these data centers be powered by renewable energy? So we are advocating for that. And right now, the bill in Colorado is a good example of this is what we think a good policy looks like. And then there's another bill in Illinois. It's called the Power Act, I believe. And working with this bring your own clean energy model. So again, incentivizing using clean energy to power data centers and also encouraging grid improvements while we're at it. So I wish we weren't expanding AI and data centers, just to be clear. I think we need massive guardrails around all of this. And so Climate Voice is certainly advocating for that around the emissions, the water, the energy use, the hazardous waste, The jobs lost, by the way, the human jobs lost by the expansion of AI. So, we're raising awareness about all of that, and then calling for policy advocacy that's looking at implementing guardrails and making sure that clean energy is absolutely what is like the top choice when it comes to how we're going to power all of this. And how can we improve the grid while we're at it? How can we help this be a moment to further electrify the grid and make the grid more able to expand our clean energy access across the country?
And if we wanted to track some of that progress, what's the best way to do it?
For right now, I would look at the Colorado bill and the Illinois bill. Like, if tracking those two bills, I think if you start there, that'll give you some idea. In terms of a centralized resource, I don't know, because there's like hundreds of data center and AI related bills right now.
Yeah.
So I'm sorry I don't have a better answer, but we'll certainly be continuing to share education, and we'll probably be doing our next policy brief on AI and data centers too, coming later this year.
Excellent. Well, I'm looking forward to that policy brief. Okay. So, Deb, you find yourself in this place where you have attained quite a bit of expert on policy and how the sausage is made, for lack of a better phrase. But it seems like, looking at your biography, you've been in the environmental advocacy game for a long time. So how did you end up in this particular niche where you're working at this private sector and policy intersection?
Yeah, thanks for asking about that. It's interesting. I think my journey has mirrored many of my peers in this space too, and maybe the environmental movement as a whole. My background is in environmental policy, and environmental leadership was my master's degree. And so I've been working for environmental nonprofits ever since, so it's like 25 plus years. But I started working with groups that were very focused on individuals making personal change. So kind of looking at your own footprint, reducing your own waste. And I think that I take responsibility for getting stuck there for some time, thinking that, oh yes, individuals have so much power, and if we all just make these different changes as consumers and members of our communities, we can change the systems. And that is true. It's absolutely true. It's just, it can't be only that. So my journey has really evolved to thinking beyond just my own lifestyle changes, which I'm happy I've been able to make so many, and then to thinking more systemically about, like we've been talking about today, what are the systems at play? What is keeping us from truly transitioning away from fossil fuels and reducing our greenhouse gas emissions in a meaningful way? Once I've started to look at that, then that's helped me to then be leading campaigns focused on pension funds and pension fund investments in fossil fuels, and how can we move that. And so I helped to start a group called Climate Safe Pensions Network. I was working here in Colorado to stop the expansion of fracking, which is a huge problem in my state, where there's oil and gas development happening right next to schools and neighborhoods, and people are getting sick. So I'm seeing firsthand the impacts of our over-reliance on fossil fuels, and then have been working to counter that here at home. And then that has then led me to be working with Climate Voice and thinking more systemically about federal and local policy and the role of corporate interests and corporate money, quite frankly, in shaping our everyday realities. And I saw that very clearly here in Colorado when I was working on stopping the expansion of fracking in my state. We were outspent 50 million to 1 by the fossil fuel industry, flooding the airwaves around, why setting any limits on where fossil fuel development can happen, why this is bad for Colorado. And that's ultimately what we're all fighting right now is, how can we counter the messages that we're hearing from these powerful interests that have so much more money than I do as an individual or an environmental nonprofit leader. And so that's what we have to continue figuring out.
I'm glad you mentioned that last thing. Would you say that's the single biggest obstacle that the movement is facing right now?
Well, that is a really good question. I would say it's that influence coupled with the political influence that is now has more transparently merged with oil and gas interests, and all of the associated misinformation that is funneled through those systems that I think everyday Americans are trying to sort through. And I think that's one of the biggest obstacles right now. It's like, how can we help the truth shine through about what's really going on, and how can we act in our own best interests once we're equipped with truth.
Yeah, the word I would use is metastasized for how those particular interests have merged. But that's editorializing.
Yeah.
Well, I'm just laughing to myself because it's like, okay, so we have federal policy and then private interests from the largest organizations on the planet and misinformation. Cool, just those three things.
I am confident that humans are going to figure out how to change this system the way we've figured out how to change other deeply entrenched systems in our past. And I'm reading a book about slavery right now, for example, and like what it took to dismantle, hundreds of years of that kind of institutionalized violence and oppression. We have to change everything when it comes to our energy use. So it can be done.
It's also, Deb, I just appreciate you taking the time to double click on that actually, because what I find myself reflecting on in this conversation is, again, as someone who identifies as not really having a bunch of desire to be involved in politics, I don't have a big desire to track all the bills and all the state, but I do still want to be involved. I think for the listeners out there who might feel powerlessness with their individuality, the next step, what I found or what I'm reflecting on is find the people in the organization like Climate Voice who are doing this work and then support them. Plug into that. Because I think it's really easy to become fatalistic thinking, well, I'm just an individual. What power do I have? But in every state, there are organizations like yours who are organizing for things that you might have shared values with or in. And so just supporting those organizations, and yes, supporting them with your dollars, is a thing you can do that does actually matter.
Absolutely. And even if it is just as simple, and it's actually not a simple thing to just donate. Like, it gives us the chance of continuing to have a civil society that's functioning, and nonprofits that can continue to do their good work, that aren't swayed by specific special interests. So I think you're absolutely right, Ian. And I would just say that moving towards a final plug, I think one of the most important things that we can do is to just be involved with any facet of our democracy and our civil society, any organization that's sort of helping to build and maintain the fabric of a healthy, functioning society. Get involved in that, donate to it, ask questions at work, like what else can your workplace be doing to be involved and be supportive of civic institutions and democratic processes. All of it matters, and it always matters, but I think it matters even more in 2026. So thank you for bringing that up.
That's great. So you've just mentioned things that individuals can do to make a difference. If there were one system level change that would make a big difference, short of changing the outcome of elections, what would it be?
Let's see. I think just getting involved at the state and local level, in local policies that you care about. It doesn't. I know I've talked a lot about climate, but maybe it's voting right now. Voting rights is big right now given the recent Supreme Court decision. Maybe it's local public transportation. Maybe it's how your utility is operating. I know some of those things might sound really wonky, but I would say probably the number one most important thing we can do right now is get involved with our local political systems, whether it's your local city council or your state government. Building relationships with those decision makers is so important right now, and keeping the flow of responsive processes is just I think absolutely the most critical thing, and that goes to at work too. It's the same thing. It's like we have to be using our voices and thus our influence to be participating in the systems that have evolved to the place that they've evolved right now, for better or for worse. Like, they're highly imperfect systems. But I would argue that what we have right now in America is still so much better than in other parts of the world where there really isn't even a chance of that kind of responsiveness. So just remembering that right now and finding at least one channel, I think that's the most important.
Yeah, are you re-inspired, Ian Williams?
Well, this is I think it's a perfect way to kind of end the conversation because, Deb just said, find some way to participate. And the reality is the work that we do, right, at Still Point Insight is an expression of how I decided to participate. It was a very calculated, methodical march of, at first I thought I was going to dig swales and plant trees and realize I don't have a green thumb, and always knew I didn't have a ton of interest in politics. But, with an organizational development skill set, it's like, well, there are organizations doing great work and we could help them do it better or do more of it, And so I think that it's just it's a wonderful place to end the conversation, is just participate. Because when you zoom out far enough, we're all part of the same system. And we are racing towards a cliff in terms of survivability.
Right.
And, and that might be terrifying. It is terrifying to think about, but it can't be an excuse to not participate.
That's right.
So yes, I am re-inspired.
Well said, partner. And Deb McNamara, thank you for all of the great organizational work that you're doing. We're grateful for you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me and having this conversation, and appreciate the work that you both are doing.
Yep. And can't wait for everybody else to hear it. Big thanks to Deb McNamara for being our guest today. You can learn more about Climate Voice at climatevoice.org. And if you're a mission-driven leader looking to grow your organization's impact, you can learn more about us at stillpointinsight.com. Thanks to you for listening and for doing the work that you do.